Okie dokie, you're good to go.
All right, good morning, everyone. Dr. Beth A. Livingston is Ralph L. Sheets Associate Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business, an internal advisor with the Healthier Workforce Center of the Midwest, a NIOSH Center of Excellence, and the faculty director of the Door Tippie Women's Leadership Program. Her research has been highlighted in the New York Times, NPR, and the Harvard Business Review, and she has been published in multiple top academic journals. Dr. Livingston has also done executive education, speaking engagements, and consulting for companies and nonprofits such as Accenture, John Deere, Yves Saint Laurent Beauty, HNI Allsteel, and Hollaback, now Right to Be, and is a co-author of the book Shared Sisterhood, published by the Harvard Business Review Press. Thanks so much for being with us here this morning.
Thank you all. I'm excited to be here. It's always, I don't think there's anything more awkward than sitting through someone introducing you and reading your bio. And thank you, Keegan. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen. Being the academic that I am, I absolutely prepared slides for this. But I also recognize, I think what makes these sorts of presentations useful and interesting and important is the ability to talk and give and take and have these sort of conversations. And so I want to encourage you to talk to me and respond and ask and chat. I have some slides here just to kind of orient you. For those of you who haven't read the book, aren't able to get around to reading the book, I will let you know that we do have a wonderful audiobook out. We were not able to record our own selves recording it, which much to our chagrin, we really wanted to do that. But I think they were right to say, well, we don't really know if you're capable of that. You're just some random professor. So perhaps we should hire an actress to do it. And the actress they hired is really lovely, and she's been in all kinds of movies and stuff. And so we really liked her, but she's also from New York. And so she gives Shared Sisterhood a wonderful little New York twang, which we also think is fun. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Shared Sisterhood as what the book is about and why we wrote it. And then oriented a little bit in what you see here, which is allyship as authentic connection. I think figuring out how we get to action is something that we're all talking about. We all care about. There are so many things, I think, going on in our own communities, in our own organizations, in the world. And we're all trying to figure out, well, what role do we play in trying to dismantle the things that the power structures that are uncomfortable for us, that result in injustice, but how we also, work to do that in our own communities. It can feel like daunting work. And it's one of the motivating factors for why Tina and I wrote this book, but why also I hope that it can be of interest to as many people as possible. So again, shout out to Dr. Tina Opie, who is my fearless and amazing co-author here. And she's at Babson College, a professor at Babson College. Excuse me. I was mentioning earlier, I woke up today with that lovely little cough that I'm sure any of you all who have young children are experiencing at this moment. So shout out to not my children who brought it home this time, but my father actually, who was here in town visiting. So we just flipped that stereotype on its head that it was my parents who brought it and not my kids this time, but I'm going to do my best. We're going to talk just a little bit about why we wrote the book and laying it out, why Tina approached me, how we started to work together. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about how we situate this in a perception and a conversation around allyship, and as well as highlighting, you all are library folks, so I know you appreciate it, a little bit of the research that is ongoing here that we're doing about this, and then some of the practical implications that hopefully you all can take from it, and then open up to any Q&A you want to talk about, whether it's about how we wrote the book and what it means for that. Those of you who, work side by side with kind of nonfiction books all the time, there's different processes. So we can talk about the meta around how this book came to be and what we learned from it. And we can talk about the content of it too, in terms of what it means for you, or concerns or questions that. So this is Tina, who is my friend and sister, and we wrote this book together, Shared Sisterhood, How to Take Collective Action for Racial and Gender Equity at Work. Tina and I met each other years and years ago. We tell the story in the book, but I'll highlight it here that we had kind of mutual circles. We were in graduate school at the same time, though she was at NYU and I was at the University of Florida. But as many people do in different academic circles, we had a conference every year that we all got together. There are tens of thousands of business professors in one place. It's quite frightening. I highly recommend you avoid it because basically we take over cities and it's really unnerving, actually. But as a young PhD student, it was wonderful. I get to go and hear all these great places, great types of research that people are doing. And she was talking about some of the work she was doing around hair and professionalism, which is really fascinating about the ways in which natural hair is perceived, particularly among Black women, and how it affects perceptions of professionalism. I thought it was really interesting. And I approached her after her talk to say, "Oh, hey, hi, I'm Beth." And, and I'm about 10 years younger than Tina was, and I'm a lot higher on the like volume scale in terms of my energy level. I like to say I'm very, if you all have golden retriever, that's basically me in human form, right? And so I really did kind of skip up to her like, hey, yeah, I really like this. And she was a little bit like, hi, arms length across. And there was a boundary there that I wasn't able to get through. She was always polite, always kind, but you could tell there was a distance that she was laying between us. And I had a moment, I had a decision at that moment of whether I wanted to try to pursue that, try to get, closer to her or not. And I chose to persist and to really lead with empathy as to why she might be leaving me at arm's length. And she also chose to do what we call dig in the book, which is figure out, well, why she was holding me at arm's length. What was it that was holding her back from connecting with me? We were able to get past that and build a relationship that started from us emphasizing our similarities and the things, we already knew we shared the same value of equity, which is incredibly important when we're building these connections. We don't advocate for creating connections with everyone, right? If you don't share some basic fundamental values, that can be not a good use of your time. But we were able to build this sort of bridge that we were then able to test and work together to make real change in our profession in particular, and work to highlight certain people, have each other's back when we weren't in the room. And we started doing research on this probably back in about 2018. And she had emailed me and said, "I got this idea. Do you want to work on it together?" And then 2020 happened, right? With everything that means. And, what we realized in that moment was what I think all of us realized it, which was that there was a real stagnation in racial and gender equity. And we were waiting for other people to solve this problem for us. Organizations started calling Tina off, her phone's ringing off the hook. What can we say? What can we do? Right? In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which is every company wanted to know the right words to say, right? At that moment. And she was like, "Wow, we really needed to write this book like yesterday, Beth, because, there's a lot of people who are trying to make up a lot of ground in this moment." And she and I were waiting. Surely other people were working on this problem and would put out solutions for it. And what we realized was, no, we were going to put forward the solution as we saw it, or a solution, a part of it. We weren't going to wait for other people to do that. And we were going to become part of this conversation. The other thing that we noticed, and that was a really long, detailed conversation. This was in sort of the heyday of Twitter, right? Which now is kind of not as useful for these purposes I've found anymore. But in that moment, we were having some really in-depth, complicated questions around, is it really about changing people's hearts and minds? Are we about changing systems? And you had really smart people with really good intentions arguing on both sides of this, right? Which is, we need to work on reducing people's individual prejudices and biases versus screw what you think and you feel. I care about the systems and whatever those systems have it. And as being the type of professors we are, where we deal in this what we call the meso space between people and what's in their hearts and between the systems and structures of our organizations. And what we realized was there was this missing piece, which was relationships. And so what we posited here with Shared Sister was how you get from what's in your heart and mind to changing the systems, which we thought was a missing conversation, and that was not able to bring these diverse groups together. The people who were really trying to put out books and programs to get people to see their own biases and move beyond them, and the people who were like, "I don't have the time for that. I just need to change these systems because they're causing immediate harm." And those people weren't always talking to each other, and we were trying to meet in the middle with that. And the other thing that I think motivated us to write this book was that she and I share what we call a radical optimism. It motivates us. It's a hopefulness that we absolutely can make change, that when there's so much going wrong, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that nothing you do matters. It actually means that everything you do matters, because there's so much that needs to be done. That means we all have the opportunity to do our part, and that we can move us, all of us, closer towards a future. And we, both of us, even in the midst of all of the injustice that we see, maintain this radical optimism. And Shared Sisterhood is a radically optimistic book because it says we can change things. And I think that is also something that a lot of people were looking for. Is there were a lot of things that were diagnosing the problem and fewer things that were saying, well, what might be a solution? And we knew it was imperfect, but we felt we needed to put it out there. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how shared sisterhood fits into this idea of allyship, which we hear people talk a little bit about. And I'm not going to go into depth on the empirics of it, right? We're not going to, go into the detail of the method, but I just want to share you a little bit of some findings from some ongoing research we're doing on this part to try to bolster shared sisterhood as a book, and then some takeaways that hopefully might be of interest to you. And Maddie, if there's anything, if people kind of, have questions that you feel you want to interrupt me with, feel free to do that. Otherwise, we can save them to the end. Perfect. So let me go back to this. So one of the things that we're seeing with this work on allyship, there's actually very little academic work, particularly in the area of organizations, about what allyship is and what its implications are. We have been talking about allyship. The conversation around allyship really often started with LGBTQ inclusion back in the 80s and 90s. We started hearing these words about what allies were. Earlier than that, but in the academic literature, it started popping up, particularly on college campuses. We started to see these conversations happening, but it didn't permeate the academic literature quite as much as it should have. And it's been a very diffuse literature. And what I mean by that is there's little pockets of it in so many different domains, right? Academics are incredibly siloed. You all, I'm sure, know this, right? There's the education journals, and there's the poli-sci journals, and there's the psych journals. And there are these small conversations happening across all of this. And so, what is common amongst this is that there's this increasing sense of disconnection and lack of belonging that people are feeling. And that's particularly true for people from historically marginalized groups, whether that's ratio ethnicity, which is kind of our combination of race and ethnicity, which is how we often perceive these things, right? I know when we gather data, we separate it into here's race, here's ethnicity. But as human beings, we often, see these as part of this sort of marginalization, or minoritization of different race and ethnicities, particularly from a United States lens, gender, sexual orientation groups. And that's particularly, we've been seeing this in research on schools and education, that there are particular groups, student groups in particular, who are marginalized and feel like they don't belong on campus. They don't feel like they belong in certain spaces. And we've been able to extend that to different organizational groups as well. But organizations are often, it's harder to get data from. Companies often do not want to let you come in, and so you can then expose how bad they are. They don't like that. In schools, it's often much easier to gather data on this stuff than organizations, which is why we don't have the data. It's not that these aren't problems in organizations. They absolutely are. That's very difficult to get an organization to agree to gather data that they are absolutely certain is going to make them look bad, right? And that's very difficult to do. But allyship is often the solution that's posited in these pieces that are about lack of belonging, right? You even see this in a growing group that is DEIB, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. That this becomes, in some organizations, use this in what I would call like a less helpful way. They are replacing their discussion of diversity and equity and justice with a discussion of belonging because it feels more sanitized. And some people are using this as that's the feeling that gets us right to equity, right? We want people to feel like that these are connected in certain ways. What's interesting and important with this is, if you ask people, do you see yourself as an ally? 80+% of white men and women will say, yeah, I'm an ally. But for instance, only 45% of Black women will say they had strong allies at work, right? And so there's this real disconnect between how people see themselves and how other people see them, which again spoke to us to the fact that this is a dyadic interpersonal phenomenon. And when we look at it from one individual perspective, we're missing the whole picture. So definitions of allyship, like I said, this is diffuse, which means people are defining it really however they want to, right? In a very particular space. They're like, yeah, this is definitely allyship, sure. But what we see here is, really some definitions that are about when members of historically advantaged or power dominant groups engage in some sort of action to benefit people from marginalized groups, in order to genuinely seek the improvement in status, that genuinely seek, there's been this discussion of how do we define it, right? Is it just actions? Is it allyship if you do this unwittingly or against your will? Is it allyship if you really want to help, but you don't know what to do? Like, or is ally a verb or a noun, right? Like, and these are real conversations that we're having. Can you be an ally? Can you name yourself an ally, right? Like all of these conversations that people are having. And you can see this Phillips, Rothbard, and Dumas and Rosette and Thompson article, which is the definition. The second definition you see here is from the organizational literature, which simplified it down when people in positions of power use their privilege to benefit people from disadvantaged groups, right? And trying to get this to the most simplistic definition that we can get it to. But most of these conversations are being had in social psychology. Most of these conversations are being had and started in the LGBTQ community. And the way these things look is different and changes over time. And importantly, the way that we talk about this colloquially has changed over time, right? Is people will wear shirts that say ally on them, right? People will put it in their bios, ally, right? We talk about this. There's even in the expanded acronym LGBTQ, some people will argue one of the A's is ally, right? Like we're having these conversations, I think, in really important moments, but there's less research to guide the theory underlying it, which is why we're getting to all these different definitions of what's going on. And so with Shared Sisterhood, we really tried to dig into this a little bit and talk about this bidirectional dynamic, that instead of situating what it means to be an ally in one person, I feel like an ally, I care about other people. We really wanted to focus on what those definitions were saying, which is it's really an interplay between two people, right? And that we need to focus on that. And that's where Shared Sisterhood comes in this sort of positive psychology way, looking for solutions and looking at what we call authentic connections between coworkers. We all know the difference between what positive psychology would talk about, these what they call high quality connections, which are, when you walk by someone and you're like, hey, how you doing? And you have like a connection with someone that gives you a little energy, gives you a little pep in your step, right? Versus the ones you have that drain you. Even seeing that person in the hallway, you're like, yeah, okay, that sucked, right? Or having an interaction on Zoom and you're like, oh, I'm so drained from this interaction. We follow up on that by saying, well, it's not just whether this interaction is high quality, but is it authentic? Do you feel that you can share authentic parts of yourself with this person? Can you share your authentic emotions? Not that can you spill everything about yourself, but if you're upset, can you say it? If you feel like you have been treated with injustice, can you say it? And can you share those authentic components of yourself with this person? Because we believe that is what takes us from someone who feels in their heart they're an ally to being able to work with that person to create change in the workplace, is these authentic moments. I can't tell you that I'm really feeling uncomfortable with how you're talking right now. I can't tell you that interaction we had in the office with our boss, I'm worried you're going to think I'm feeling like too sensitive about this, right? Like you need to be able to have those authentic connections and be able to share your emotions with someone, right? And that this is this sort of bi-directional coalition building in the service of equity. Importantly, in the book, we talk about the differences between allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators. And this is using colloquial language to be able to point out where we thought some of the lacking part of the theory was, which is just actions to advance the well-being of people who are from disadvantaged groups. The problem with that is, of course, that it doesn't, again, link what's in people's hearts to the actions they're doing. So when we talk about allies, what we're essentially often talking about, I have thoughts and feelings. I care about, people from other groups. But you may not be willing to put yourself out there, right? And really take a risk, right? Are you speaking up in meetings? Are you taking that heat on yourself? Or are you pulling someone aside in the hallway and being like, oh my gosh, that sucked. Did you see how someone said this slur against? Thank you. I saw it. I don't really need you to share I don't need to also handle your emotions. But oftentimes allies are still in that sort of stage of, right, really centering themselves in that moment. As we move towards kind of what Dr. Tiffany Jana and Ella Bell would talk about here is co-conspirators. Accomplices are, actively work to dismantle systems of oppression. And this is where I often meet people who are kind of in this accomplished stage. Like, I'm actually willing to do the work. It's just oftentimes they're blind to a little bit of their own privilege of not always knowing the right solutions. And so there's a lot of, oh, I got you. I'll stand in front of you. I'll advocate for what you need, without, there's less listening to, well, what are the people who are being affected say that they need? Oftentimes what accomplices do is they flip the dynamic. They use what they've learned, right, to try to correct systemic, bias. They're moving there, right? But they're often standing in front of people who might want to be standing aside next to them, right? And so with co-conspirators, you're often working alongside those communities, right? And so you're moving from, I'm working within my community, I really care about these sorts of things, but sometimes you might not be listening as much as you should to what this community says that they need or want. One of the arguments that Tina often uses is, imagine you come in, a guy comes in, there's a bunch of women who are advocating for pay equity in their organization. And a man comes in, he's like, I got you. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to get you all raises. I'm going to get you all what you need. Right. And, goes off and does this without sitting down and taking the time to listen and saying, well, what is it? What does systemic change look like for you? What would make you, how can I uplift you to advocate in this way? Do you need me to do this for you? Do you want me to do this for you? Right. And so again, it's just a continued movement. Those arrows are representing you're moving down this journey. It's a constant journey to get where they don't co-opt the cause. Conspirators don't co-opt the cause. They recognize leaders who are doing work in justice spaces and don't feel that they're superior to the people who are doing that work. And that is often when I'm working, for instance, with white people who are working in spaces to fight against anti-Blackness, it's often moving from accomplice to co-conspirators that I'm working with them on, which is, you don't always know the answers, and what you might think is right isn't always what people need. And it's not always about people seeing you. There's going to be people who don't trust you no matter how many t-shirts you wear and how many events you've shown up to. And that's okay, because it's not about you, right? And that is often the most difficult conversations that I'm having with people in this space. So what do those conversations with people in this space look like? Well, with Shared Sisterhood, we talk about three functions. We talk about digging, bridging, and acting, where digging is this, individual, right? Like underlying, you're working on yourself. Bridge is connecting with other people in those authentic ways. And acting is building those bridges become like a lattice that allows us to act together. I was just speaking with a woman who runs an organization that looks at how you create change in organizations. And I was saying, it'd be so easy if every organization we were trying to change, there was just one person. It's like a movie. If I can get him to see the world that way, then he'll change everything, and we'll have justice in our organizations. That's not how most organizations work, because in most organizations, there are dozens of people who have control over the systems, dozens of people who implement and design, and right. And so it's not enough just to change one person's hearts and minds. We have to have some sort of concerted effort to evaluate, to hold accountable. And that often takes more people than just, a couple people who, are willing to stand up. It also means the more people you get together, the more likely you're going to have conflicts with people, right? Or people who don't like each other. And what I think is one of the things I like most about Shared Sisterhood is it doesn't require us all to be friends for us to work together for equity. It does require authentic connections, but those doesn't mean that we have to share our whole lives and friendships. There are people who, I don't necessarily like. I wouldn't go hang out with on the weekends, but I trust that they're going to have my back if I'm not around. And I trust that they're going to advocate towards the cause that we have. And then there are some people who I'm in this fight with who don't trust me because of whatever they see in me, whatever experiences they've had in their past with people who were like me. But they trust someone that I am connected to as a sister, right? And so we're still all able to work together along those lines. And I think those of us who still have very individual views, and this is particularly true just my work with white women, we always like to be liked, or at least maybe that's just a, Southern white woman thing that I have. It can be hard to let go that there are going to be some people who don't trust you when you're doing this work, no matter how good your heart is. I go out and give talks on this, and I will get messages that will say, I really like the words you're saying, Beth, but I'm sorry, I just can't believe that's where you are. And I'm like, that's fine, right? Because you're on a different journey than I'm on. And I don't need to convince you to trust me personally. And I think that that's a really important part of the journey that we go along with. And of course, only being able to speak from my own perspective. So I'm going to talk through each of those three functions just a little bit, and then I will share with you some ongoing research we're working on, just briefly. So when we talk about dig, we're talking about developing an understanding of what our identities are and how those identities are associated with power, both within and outside of our organizations. We actually build on Kimberly Crenshaw's principles of intersectionality when she was doing work, really thinking about how different identities intersect and interact with systems of power to affect the outcomes that people experience. She was focused primarily in the legal system and criminal justice system, but those sort of ideas have continued on with talking about interactions with other systems of power. And so, for instance, you might have Venn diagrams of different identities, and certain which of these identities are associated with power. The way we talk about these things is often you have power, you don't have power, but really it's identities that have power, right? And in certain situations, I will have the most power in the room, and in certain situations, I will have the least. And I think that's one of the most important things that our dig process helps people understand, is that it doesn't make you a good or a bad person to have particular identities. It's how you understand yourself and how you navigate among them that helps you to build connections with other people. I will say about this that there are some people who stop here. They understand themselves. They understand, wow, I've been prejudiced in the past. That sucks. I really want to do better about that. But this is where their quest towards allyship ends, right? Which is with the investigation of the self. Bridge is about authentic connections. I mentioned that earlier. But what do we mean by authentic connections? So we've broken it down to kind of 4 component functions that when you connect with other people, you should try to make sure that you're showing empathy and developing empathy in those connections, that you're demonstrating vulnerability, right? You're able to, be vulnerable in that moment and share concerns that you have, that you're building trust, and that you're willing to take risks. Depending on the dig that you've done and what identity is salient in that moment, right? And in that certain context, you might be the one that has to take the most risks in that situation. You might be the one that has to build trust and learn to trust people. Tina and I talk about this when she and I are talking about race. I'm doing a lot more listening than I'm doing talking, right? And I have to sometimes build trust by taking risks, by putting my own resources out there. When she and I talk about religion, and we're talking about different things, and that dynamic changes. And I think depending on what conversation you're having and who you're having it with, the idea then is to think of these 4 things and try to make sure that the interactions you're having are characterized by these things, right? Showing empathy, taking that dig work that you've done and demonstrating that you have empathy for other people's perspectives, working to build trust, by demonstrating your own vulnerability and taking risks, not by like, trust me, which very rarely works. And so I think thinking about each particular interaction you have with a person is laying one plank down on a bridge that will get stronger the more that these interactions are characterized by authenticity, empathy, vulnerability, trust, and risk-taking. The question then after that is, well, what do you do with those sort of connections? We like to say that building authentic connections is a positive end in and of itself, right? It's good just to have authentic connections with people. They tend to be energy giving. They tend to be, just a positive part of people's well-being overall. But in Shared Sisterhood, we're really focused on equity, right? And so what you do with those bridges matters. And what you're able to do with those bridges is to act as an ally to achieve equity, right? What I think is important here and what differentiates what we're talking about with Shared Sisterhood from some other approaches is that there's a lot of very transactional approaches to coalition building that's built in researching actually unions in a lot of ways, which is, well, we have a transactional reason that we're working together. We care about the same outcome. We are going to work together for as long as it takes to achieve that end, right? But that also means that sometimes those coalitions are very vulnerable to attack, to divide and conquer tactics. They're vulnerable to conflict and infighting, and they're vulnerable to losing a person who happened to be the one person that was holding everything together, right? And, I think what Shared Sisterhood does a little differently is it says, well, when those bridges are strong, they can withstand the work that needs to be done and the conflict that needs to be done, because there's trust inherent in those connections, and there's, empathy inherent in those connections. What we focus on a lot are metrics for success and accountability, and that there's people within your shared sisterhood network who are able to hold different people accountable. Because again, like we said, in most organizations, it's groups of people who are in charge of systems, but they are people, right? And that's our connection to what I said at the beginning, which is, how do we get from what's in people's hearts and minds to changing systems? Well, it's people who create systems. It's people who maintain systems. It's people who reinforce systems. And thus it has to be people who dismantle them. So we followed up this sort of approach and shared sisterhood with doing some research. And one of the things that we wanted to really focus on here was this idea of, risk taking in inclusive climates, right? Like, organizations have been really focused on, how do we make our climate more inclusive? How do we work on that? And we really wanted to focus on, well, what makes people want to share their emotions authentically with others? What makes people be willing to build that trust and share that authenticity and those emotions? And so we did an experiment. We're following this up. We're working on a follow-up experiment to this, where we were really looking at, what's building these sorts of trust and relationships. And this is a lot of words, so don't feel free. You don't have to read them. I'll just point out the key moment here, which is, you're in a meeting and someone says something that is a racial micro/macro aggression, right? Which is, hey, well, if you're really that adamant about wanting a diverse hiring pool, we just have to ignore qualifications or competencies, right? Which of course is the idea that, people who are not white are less competent or less qualified. And what we focused on this moment was a risk-taking step, right? Which is, does someone speak up? Do they not speak up in that moment, right? Or not? People really didn't differentiate between whether you said, like, I will report to HR or I won't participate. It was really just the speaking up in general that was seen as a risk. And so we collapsed those things together. What do we find? Like, we surveyed a few hundred people, 200 people, with these scenarios, white and not white. Most of our sample were either non-white Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic, or Asian American. And we did in the US context. And what we found was that it was really whiteness that mattered here in terms of the perception of this risk taking. And what we found, that ECC is just, am I willing to share my emotions with her? Am I trusting her with the way I feel about things in this authentic way? And what we found is that risk taking, that dotted line, is not significant from 0, which means that risk taking did not matter, right, for people who weren't white, but risk taking really mattered for people, risk taking did not matter for people who were white. Risk taking really mattered for people who weren't. This may seem very obvious, but it is very important, right? Because we controlled in the scenario for whether you liked this person, whether this person talked to you outside of it, but that risk taking was a huge moment for whether someone thought that they could connect with this person in a real valuable way. We followed this up with we asked them to describe Jessica, who was the person who we said spoke up. And we, coded those. And those were our two kind of biggest groups there. And what we saw is that when Jessica sat there and looked uncomfortable but didn't do anything, our Black and Asian respondents were really upset by that. Like, oh, I'm glad you feel uncomfortable, but you didn't do anything about it. And some of them shared stories about, yeah, people are willing to pull me aside in the hallway and be like, yeah, that really sucked, but aren't willing to speak up. And that made things way worse. And the idea that you would see it and not say it, but would say it in private, actually escalated the negative emotions here, and made people way less likely to feel that they could trust to connect with that person. Again, we saw very racialized differences in what people said, right? Like, where people thought there was this sort of virtue signaling, and not in a good way, that they didn't actually feel that. And people who were in the low risk, that it was mostly our Black and Asian respondents and we gathered this data in the middle of the Stop Asian Hate situation that was happening during COVID. And so these sorts of events were not surprising that we saw Asian American respondents being particularly upset by people not speaking up in these sorts of moments. And, it was really interesting to hear these very particular backlash moments that were happening, and the types of words that people were using, which were obviously being pulled from the political zeitgeist of the moment, which is virtue signaling, value signaling, right? These sorts of things that were coming up, and demonstrated to us that there's a lot more work that we need to be doing about how people see the risks that allies take in these moments and how they work to build authentic relationships and build trust between people, and what that risk really means when oftentimes we're talking about predominantly white workplaces in a lot of these spaces, and what that means for the backlash that people will participate or will experience. So what can you do here? I think to summarize, like, a lot of solutions in diversity, equity, inclusion are either focused at the individual level, like, oh, take anti-racism seminars, individual perspective taking, empathy building, or let's just change organizational policies. Let's strong arm organizational policy change, which again, I would love to change policies. That's what we're all about. But I think obvious sometimes ignores the actual dynamics in workplaces about how those things happen. And I think what we try to do as Shared Sisterhood is kind of have this both and approach. You need to both dig into your own preconceptions about race and connect with others. You need to grow individually and connect interpersonally and create change institutionally. We did see some initial research that suggested that authentic connections did vary across groups. They were related to these allyship perceptions. And that risk taking was really critical, particularly from people from minoritized groups, that people were much more willing to say, I can trust this person, and much more willing to say this person should lead the anti-racism task groups, right? Which I think is really an important recommendation there as well. So moving to sort of the practical implications, what have we learned as we've gone out into organizations and communities and talked about this? One of the things when I go out, and particularly I talk as a white woman and the kind of white woman half of our Shared Sisterhood group, I often talk a lot to other white women, which I think is one of the things Tina and I have done very intentionally with this is, think about who's the right messenger for different components of things. We tag each other in when there's certain conversations that she's like, I'm not, this is an exhausting conversation, Beth, can you please take it? Absolutely. And one of the things is that there's often not a lot of honesty. People aren't often being very honest with themselves about what their identities are, what their experiences have been related to race, gender, and other identities. And part of this is one thing that we have found is that because a lot of these conversations are happening on social media, they're essentially conversations happening in the public square, right? And it becomes much as social media can help build communities around injustice and oppression, they can also make it difficult for us to solve these issues because they're very good for in-group communication and very difficult to have cross-group communications because you're having them in the public square. Showing vulnerability invites people in who are in different parts of their journey, for better or worse, and it creates, you're not having a dyadic conversation between you and one other person, you're having you to the many, and that can be very difficult to actually solve these problems. And as my discussion, for instance, we had a Facebook group, like 4,000 women that Tina had started and that we had worked on during the pandemic that has kind of fallen off a little bit because some of these conversations that were being had were magnifying, were making harm worse. Because they were working through their own biases in public, right? In a way that people couldn't opt out of. And so, those were difficult to have. But the people who made the most growth were the ones who were most honest with themselves about what their biases were. And not in a way that said, I'm a bad person and I should go crawl in a hole, but I can do better and I want to do better. Demonstrating empathy, vulnerability, trust, and risk-taking when you're connecting with others, particularly when they're different from you, those are just good. Every time we're doing research on those are just generally good things, right? And whether or not you're able to work with that person to actually create change in your organization, ask questions, listen to the answers, demonstrate growth. I do a whole section when I do this about how to apologize appropriately, which surprisingly a lot of people haven't learned. And then remembering that actions are more important than words. You can say a lot of good words. You can wear that t-shirt. You can put a sign in your yard or a sign in but people will see what you do. and they will judge by what you do. And I have had this conversation with dozens of organizations that have put out all kinds of statements, and I'm like, but look at your policies, right? People are not stupid. They will see what you do more than what you say. And that's particularly also true when you're talking about building relationships. As you're building these connections, trying to find opportunities to promote equity at work, and you can start with small moments to change culture and policies. I know it can be difficult to be you should never be satisfied with incremental change, but incremental change is still positive change. And that's when we're working with organizations and people have to take risks, which is I could lose my job, I could lose my, my family and my support. It can be difficult to say, well, what am I willing to do? And identifying those opportunities to create change can help build trust and reinforce these bridges that have been built. If you're a leader, I think don't discount the importance of these authenticities. It matters even more when you're in a position of positional power, right? Regardless of what your kind of social identities are, a leader, you have power just by nature of the position that you've earned or been given within your organization. When you could role model that sort of authenticity, listening, empathy, risk-taking, that can create these sort of opportunities. We also talk in the book about what we call a shared sisterhood safe culture, which is creating a place where people can take risks and be vulnerable without experiencing backlash, where people can have conversations about race and power and difference without feeling like, we're not going to get anywhere with it. And that means following up on things. Don't just have an empty suggestion box that doesn't go anywhere. Being clear about how you're going to use the data that you collect, and role modeling, dig and bridge. Here's what I learned. I am always shocked at how many leaders don't immediately own up for when they screw up and rather just try to push it off and pretend like it always makes it, every time it makes it worse when you do that, right? And so role modeling those sorts of things can be incredibly helpful. But also, if you're a leader, hold yourself and others accountable for change. You have that sort of power to do it. You have the metrics already. You're already holding people accountable for something. We'll add these sorts of metrics into what you're holding people accountable for. Even if you're just starting with, okay, well, we want to talk about, we want to do crosstabs of turnover within certain racial groups, and you're going to be held accountable for the different, right? Adding things on top of what we already do can start to change the conversation around what equity actually means. So this is our book. Feel free. Prairie Lights, I know, used to have them. I think unless they've sold out, they still do. And again, audiobook and Kindle and everything else has it. And now I am happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'll make myself not a small, tiny little face. And so it will be a little bit less awkward.
All right, thank you, Beth. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so people can ask questions.